Hello, everybody. Dr. Vasquez here, and I'm going to reply to a recent question. Today is January 13th, 2023. So the question was about chronic infection with Chlamydia pneumoniae, also called Chlamydophila pneumoniae, depending on whoever's writing it and whatever textbook you're reading. Probably both names are correct, although last time I checked, which was a few years ago, Chlamydophila was preferred over chlamydia when talking about Chlamydophila pneumoniae. So you can see the question that was posted on the website. I'm going to address this question mostly using the information from Inflammation Mastery, and I'll show you the page numbers. Actually, the page numbers are already written in my reply. So the page numbers I'm going to focus on are pages 918, 919, also a little bit of information, I believe, from chapter 4, pages 398 and 441. So basically, what I want to say is kind of outline the approach to addressing this type of chronic infection, which I myself had. You can see that this page from chapter 5, when I talk about Chlamydia pneumoniae, that's actually my case. So I was the patient that I'm discussing in that case. This was about 2011, I believe. At that time, I went to a conference, and I actually learned about this at that time from one of the presenters. He was talking about persistent Chlamydophila infection. And, I wasn't necessarily sick at that time, but I think at that time, and I described this in the book, I did have a lot of sinus congestion. I remember because I just relocated. This was 2011. Those are some pretty tough years for me because I was relocating. I had just finished medical school. I relocated once, I relocated again, I relocated a third time. So that was Austin. Let's see, where was I? So that was Fort Worth, Texas, to Austin, Texas, to Bend, Oregon, and then out of Austin, Texas, to Portland, Oregon. So that was a lot of moving around. And, getting out of medical school and, working in hospitals and doing all this kind of stuff. So at that time, that's right, I'm remembering a little bit more about it now. So at that time, I just had like this chronic sinus congestion. So when I went to this conference and this doctor who has published quite a bit on this topic, he was talking about Chlamydophila. I didn't really care about it very much, but I said, okay, I'll test myself and I'll see what the results are, and I'll see if I can do anything with it. So I did test myself, and these are my test results on the screen. Sorry, my screen just went black for a second because of the screensaver. These are my test results. So my Chlamydia pneumoniae IgG was at a titer of 1 at 256. So according to the conference presentation and according to the research that supports this, it may have been from the same author. I'd have to look to correlate that, but he did have some publications, and that's why I was trusting his work at that time. So at that time, the antibodies were quite high. So I treated myself with acetylcysteine, whatever the dose, 600 milligrams, maybe 3 times a day would be reasonable. And also I treated myself with azithromycin. And I do remember, and I've written it out here as well, I did feel worse for about a day. I felt just kind of fatigued and congested, worse congestion. But then after that, as the saying goes, I was kind of like Phoenix rising out of the flames. I felt a lot better, didn't have the congestion, and had more energy and better exercise endurance, as I state here in the book. But this was my case. And one of the things I wanted to point out about this case and similar cases, so we see this specifically with chlamydia, and we see this with Chlamydia pneumoniae, that is. And we also see this with herpes infections, that the higher the antibody titer, that doesn't represent a better immune response. It represents a frustrated and ineffective immune response. So, for example, in this case, according to the vaccine model, more antibodies are better. And that's absolutely not the case in medicine, except in the vaccine paradigm where they're trying to sell vaccines and they're trying to tell people that they need to have high antibody titers all the time. That is not the situation. a lot of times higher antibody levels. You also see this in kids with autism. Kids with higher, I believe it's antibody response to the measles vaccine. Kids with higher antibody response to measles vaccine are the ones more likely to have adverse effects due to that vaccine. In the context of autism, as I'm recalling, I haven't looked at that in a couple of years, but that's how I recall it. Also, if you look at people who have persistent herpes infections, the people who have higher antibody titers are the people who are more likely to go on to develop complications. And I believe and I'm pretty sure I have that in the book, in the section on viral infections. The consequence that we're concerned about with herpes infections, of course, is Alzheimer's. So the people, and it may just be generalized fatigue as well, but again, the point is higher antibody titers doesn't mean a better immune response. It means a frustrated and ineffective immune response. What you want with an infection is, let's say it's a recurrent infection or a second exposure. So antibody levels would be low because you don't want antibody levels to be high all the time. You want antibody levels to be low, and then at the event of an exposure, you want those antibody levels to go up. Supposedly, those neutralize the infection, and then they go back down. If antibody levels were to be high all the time, that would by itself cause disease. And it's immune complex mediated vasculitis, nephritis, and other complications, including pulmonary complications. But you do not want to have high antibody levels all the time. That's specifically been shown for chlamydia pneumoniae, herpes simplex infections, and again, the antibody response to measles vaccination in kids who are at risk for autism. So higher antibody levels is not a good thing. You want a modulated immune response. You don't want an exaggerated immune response. So in this case, again, this was me. I treated myself with NAC. If I were to do that now, I'd probably use 600 milligrams 3 times a day. I do kind of preventively treat myself with about, I believe, let me just think for a minute, 1,200 milligrams per day, sometimes 1,800. So it's still pretty close to 600 milligrams 3 times a day. It's just a ballpark number, but more than 600, 1,200 is good, 1,800 is okay. I mean, all those numbers are reasonable. It doesn't have to be, 5,400 milligrams per day. It doesn't have to be that high. But around a gram or two is pretty reasonable for assertive prevention, let's say. So again, anyway, I treated myself with NAC and azithromycin and my usual, supplement plan, and that worked really well for me at that time. Now, of course, I was already on a good paleo-Mediterranean diet, as you would expect, and the only other thing I would add to that conversation is maybe adding some Lugol solution or a combination of iodine and iodide together. Let's say somewhere at least 2 grams per day, maybe 5 grams, and we could probably go higher than that. But again, I haven't gone much higher than that, but I would be comfortable doing that. 2 to 5 grams, I think, would be okay. I'd probably keep it at 2 grams based on my comfort level with that intervention right now. But I think that would be a reasonable approach. So let's again talk about the overall approach. As far as therapeutics go, patients need to be on a good, healthy paleo-Mediterranean diet. That doesn't mean eating, Italian pizza whenever they want. It means a good, solid paleo-Mediterranean diet, a disciplined diet, but one that's certainly nutrient dense. And of course, that goes, the closer to paleo we get, the more nutrient dense we get. And I'll just leave it at that because that kind of summarizes the situation. So we want a good paleo-Mediterranean diet, vitamin D, multivitamin, multimineral, hopefully some fish oil and probiotics. That's kind of the start for everybody. And that's my 5-part dietary plan. On top of that, again, for chlamydia pneumoniae specifically, if we're concerned that somebody has an intracellular infection, like a persistent infection, then sure, we could add some NAC. I think we could reasonably add Lugol solution at about 2 grams per day. And obviously the antibiotic. In this time period of my life, I was really fond of azithromycin, and I think it was an appropriate treatment for this situation. generally speaking, the treatment for dysbiosis and any type of persistent infection has three components. So one is antimicrobial, the other is immune support, and then the other is kind of damage mitigation or anti-inflammatory treatments. So again, that's the approach that I would use in this case. The fourth component to that general routine, so again, antimicrobial, anti-inflammatory, or mitigation, let's say, and immune support. The fourth component, which just kind of extends the way that I've discussed this for many years, would be to add iodine and iodide, simply because it's high value. It's broad spectrum antimicrobial. The data has continued to evolve on that over the last couple of years, and I've seen good results in terms of what I'm observing in the literature, which is, arguably better than my own clinical experience, because if I'm looking at it from someone else's publication, they've got multiple investigators, they've published it and all that kind of stuff. So rather than, say, yeah, I've seen it work, a lot of times I actually prefer to rely on research that's been independently published. So anyway, that's my response to this question on intracellular and persistent chlamydia, and especially Chlamydia pneumoniae. And, with like Chlamydia trachomatis, we do see some correlation between what appears to be a persistent infection and various autoimmune diseases, especially rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia is not typically autoimmune, but those patients can carry persistent infections. Gulf War illness is another area where these infections seem to be pretty common. And the other one is, again, autoimmunity, but specifically ankylosing spondylitis. So hopefully that adds a little bit more insight into that question and kind of the clinical approach. You can see again this conversation on page 918 of Inflammation Mastery, and then my own case report, because that was me, those are my lab results, on page 919. Also, in another section of the book, right here on page 441, I also talk about Chlamydia pneumoniae, and in various other sections within chapter 4 in the section on dysbiosis. So I hope that addresses completely the question. I might look into this a little more just to see if anything new has come about, but I still think the general approach is going to be exactly what I said. Good foundational diet, because that bridges the gap between immune support and anti-inflammatory nutrition, because those are two components of the overall approach to treating dysbiosis and persistent infections. Anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, immune support, and then again adding the fourth component, which is iodine and iodide. So hope you're all doing well. Again, today is January 13th, 2023. I'll get this quickly edited and posted on the website. And I'll try to address a few more questions while I'm at it. Thank you much and take care.